My name is John Walton, Lord Walton of Detchant. I'm the former Professor of Neurology and Dean of Medicine in Newcastle University. The purpose of this particular recording is that I became, in 1970, I was elected a member of a notable medical travelling club called the Medical Pilgrims. The Pilgrims was founded in 1920s by Sir Arthur Hurst in London, and among the first members were Professor Fred Nattrass of Newcastle and Professor James Spence, who later became Sir James Spence, who was the Foundation Professor of Paediatrics. Professor Nattrass was, for many years, the Secretary of the Pilgrims. The purpose of the Pilgrims is to travel once a year for 3 or 4 days to another location, either in the UK or occasionally abroad every few years, in order to learn something of the research being done in the host situations, usually university hospitals and universities, and to be able to discuss the presentations which are prepared for us by our host. There is always time for some sightseeing, and there's always time as well for good dining in the evenings. But it's an admirable institution. Now, in 1971, at my first pilgrimage, I took with me an 8mm cine camera and took some pictures, and later did so in the course of the next few years. Now, these cine films were of very variable quality. They were transferred onto a VHS recorder and then later still to a DVD, so I must apologize for the quality. But my fellow pilgrims think that the recording will be of considerable historical interest, and I'm therefore going to try my best, as the pictures roll by, to identify the names of the individuals who appear on the recordings. Now, our first pilgrimage at which the pictures were taken was to Denmark, and we went across the North Sea from Newcastle, actually, on a ferry, and the pictures begin on the ferry. Now here, walking along the deck, is Sir Melville Arnott from Birmingham, followed by Sir Derek Dunlop, the Professor of Therapeutics from Edinburgh, and that is Dr. John Stokes, who actually only died very recently in his 90s, and that is Dick Bomford, later Sir Dick Bomford, Richard Bomford, who was the Registrar of the Royal College of Physicians, John Badenoch from Oxford, also looking much slimmer than he later became, and just a few irrelevant pictures of the ship, and there were lifeboats, but gladly they were not required. And there is John Butterfield, along with John Stokes, and D.K. O'Donovan from Dublin in the brown suit, again with Melville Arnott. John Butterfield was at this time the Secretary of the Pilgrims. Oh, and that is John Valence Owen, who was a physician in Newcastle for some time before becoming the Professor of Medicine in Belfast. Now, this just a few irrelevant pictures of fishing boats slipping by. And here on the left, we just missed him, is Dr. Hawkins. And then at the back is Sir George Smart. And here we are in Aarhus, which was our first port of call, looking across from our hotel windows across the city of Aarhus. There was a very fine diabetologist who worked here called Professor Lundbeck. All the members of his staff followed his pattern of going around not fully tying up their ties. They had the knot of the tie hanging 6 inches below the collar, and every member of department imitated the boss and did exactly the same. He also wore a rather striking corduroy suit, and John Butterfield was so impressed that in Aarhus he went and had one made. It didn't actually suit John nearly as well. That's a view from my hotel window, I think not very relevant. But here we are, Derek Dunlop on the left, D.K. O'Donovan, John Bomford, and that on the left I don't recall who that is. But there on the right, yes, Again, I'm not certain who that was. I think it was Professor Hardy from Birmingham, but I'm not. No, it wasn't. It was Cyril Clarke, who later became president of the Royal College of Physicians. He was an avid pilgrim. That is just the church in Aarhus, and that is the opera house in the centre of the city. Now, we had some excellent presentations, not only from Lundberg and his colleagues, but also from a number of colleagues. Now, that on the right with the moustache, I think, is Professor Singh, who was the last Regius Professor of Medicine in Dublin, who was the son of the most notable dramatist and theologian J.M. Singh. There is John Butterfield and John Stokes and Derek Dunlop. They were lovely. It was in the spring, beautiful carnations. Beautiful flowers out in the gardens, rhododendrons, and that again is just a picture of Aarhus. I don't know who that is taking the picture. And there in the centre is again John Butterfield and D.K. O'Donovan and Clifford Hawkins, also from Birmingham, is there. And on the left is Robert Marler, who was a physician. Oh, yes. And there, next to John Valence-Owen, is Professor or Dr. Donald Hunter, one of the founders of occupational medicine in the UK. And that is Sir John Ellis, who was a professor in London, talking to D.K. O'Donovan, and that is Donald Hunter, the man who once said at one of the Pilgrim dinners that he thought British medicine had no future. After all, he said, Osler was dead, Hippocrates was dead, and he wasn't feeling very well himself. But he was a great character and highly entertaining, but a very able man, as I say, one of the founders of occupational medicine in the UK. His book on diseases of occupations was really very well known. So here we are, and that's Clifford Hawkins and MacDonald Critchley, who was also a pilgrim, though he soon dropped out as the time went by. That's Sir John Ellis and Dr. Clifford Hawkins. That's George Smart in the centre, and on his and that is Dennis O'Sullivan from Cork, and there is Clifford Hawkins with Sir John Ellis. Notice how many of the pilgrims smoked at that time. None of them now do. Now here we're moving on, because this was the next pilgrimage, and that is, I think, the Palace Beaulieu in Vienna. And there is Michael Oliver from Edinburgh. It was an exceptionally hot day. Before we went on, no, it's the Schönbrunn Palace. The Schönbrunn Palace. And that is looking over from the palace across the entrance courtyard. It was so hot that day that John Butterfield, when he went to the loo, made the very irreverent comment was that all he could do was to produce a few puffs of steam. But that's part of pilgrim law. Nice gardens outside the Schönbrunn Palace, and we were well housed in the Hotel Erzherzog Rainer in Vienna. Very comfortable. Now, also, while we were in Vienna, naturally the pilgrims went out to the Vienna woods to enjoy the new wine in Grinzing. But as it was in the evening, I didn't take my cine camera with me. But the pilgrims enjoyed, I think, a very interesting and slightly riotous evening in Grinzing. That's the Schönbrunn. The former palace was the Beaulieu. And it's a very beautiful palace, of course, in Vienna, one of the finest. So, more Schönbrunn. Now, from Vienna, we were entertained, actually, by the neurologists, whom I had managed to persuade to produce a program for us. And it was really extremely good. So there it is, Butterfield, Hawkins, Badenoch, Hunter, Marler. That's the Beaulieu. That's the Beaulieu. The Palace Beaulieu in Vienna. It was the neurologists, the Viennese neurologists, who laid on the program for us. But then we had decided that we were going to go down the Rhine on the hydrofoil to Budapest for the second part of the program. That was the Vienna Wheel, not anything like as good as the London Eye. These are some of our hosts. Clifford Hawkins on the left, John Butterfield there, and that's a very good one of D.K. O'Donovan. And there's Michael Oliver, cardiologist from Edinburgh. Now we're just about to embark on the boat to go down the Rhine to Budapest. Clifford Hawkins was slightly confused because he was trying to change his money. Well, that's Sir John Ellis with the black cap and George Smart smoking a cigar. Clifford Hawkins was confused. He was trying to change his money into Romanian, not realizing, of course, that we were actually going to Hungary. So there he is with Donald Hunter and Sir Melville Arnott. Now, we're off on the hydrofoil in a minute. Nothing much to say just at this particular moment. It was an interesting journey past some of the older and impressive buildings of Vienna as we went down the Rhine. It wasn't a particularly brilliant day, so the clarity here is not great. That, I think, is the Loreley on the left, the big rock from which the maiden was alleged to have jumped to her death. And it's said that every now and then the voice of the Loreley rings out over the Rhine. Anyhow, we arrived in Budapest. Now, who is that? As he turns his head, I'm not certain. I can't identify him. But it was quite useful. Now, here we're arriving in Budapest, and that actually is the old Parliament building, which is in Pest. And we went across there. No, I'm not certain. I'm not certain of that. But certainly when we went to Budapest, we were in our hotel on Buda, and of course looked across to Pest, where the old Parliament building was, and the old Hungarian House of Lords is now, that's it, that's the Parliament building in Budapest, and the old Hungarian House of Lords is now a major conference centre. And this is at the hospital where we had some excellent presentations from our Hungarian colleagues. Again, gathering outside, Robert Marler, John Ellis and others. We went out on a bus trip to a rehabilitation centre on a lake. We also went into the cathedral, which was extremely impressive. And indeed, it was a very delightful pilgrimage. This is on the walls of Buda, very beautifully constructed, and that is the cathedral, and again a very impressive building. So we always had the opportunity, as I said, of doing a bit of sightseeing, along with listening to science. And there we are, looking across from the walls of Buda, across the Danube, across to Pest on the other side. No, this is looking backwards into the city of Buda. And there we are, across the Danube. It was rather misty, so the Parliament building didn't come out with great clarity that time. But the woods behind the buildings there were really quite attractive. That's the Parliament building again, through the mist. Not bad, considering it was an old 8mm film that produced this recording. And there is, again, John Stokes and John Butterfield with the black blazer among the tourists. This is a little bit of a scenic picture. Now, here we have John Stokes. Now, who that is, I'm not certain. There's Clifford Hawkins, and there's John Ellis. I suspect we had one of our hosts there with us walking along the streets. And it's a charming city, and some of the architecture is really very attractive, some of it quite reminiscent of what you see in Russia. Oh, I'm sorry. That's an interjection of my younger daughter's wedding, which happened to sneak into this recording by mistake. Now, we're going on a bus now. There's Robert Marler, and that is Dick Bomford. And now, of course, we're in Edinburgh, because the Edinburgh pilgrimage was the next one in 1973. And that, of course, is the old city of Edinburgh. And there's Brian Matthews, who's no longer with us, and John Valensoen, and there Clifford Hawkins, and there's Donald Hunter again. Oh, and that's Fred Nattrass of Newcastle, who was the original secretary, and David Pike, who had become the secretary. He was the scribe of the Pilgrims. And this time we're visiting in Scotland, Culross in Fife. But then also, and that's Nattrass in the middle, and then Stokes, and then Ellis, and John Ellis on the right. This, I think, is when we went to Culross in Fife. And later still, on one of our outings, we went to Trackware House, and that is looking across to the further forth. This is near Culross, and there is D.K. O'Donovan, and who is that? Now, at the moment, my memory fails me, but I'm sure my pilgrim colleagues will be able to identify who that was in the middle, although he may have been one of our hosts. This is rather dark, I'm afraid. So again, I can identify. Yes, Hunter. I think it comes back again in a moment. Yes. This is from Trackware House, looking down towards the water of the further forth. Obviously, I didn't get the exposure right on this particular bit of the film. John Badenoch there. And we're all gathered outside this lovely old house, which was charming, with rather attractive gardens, but they don't come out at all well on this particular film. I do remember the Edinburgh pilgrimage in particular, because it was 1973. I'd only been a consultant for 15 years, and this was long before the major inflation of the mid-70s. Derek Dunlop had a singularly patrician air. He was a delightful man, but he lived in a castle not very far from Edinburgh, and he had expensive tastes. And I remember, as I was a fairly young consultant, being shocked to find that he had actually got out for the pilgrims' dinner some of the finest wines that were available. And there's Brian Matthews and Donald Hunter, and there's Fred Nattrass again. Derek Dunlop had got some of the finest wines from the cellar of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, so that at that time the dinner in 1973 cost £35, which was a rather substantial sum in those days. So this is Trackware House again. You may get the impression from watching these film recordings that we didn't do much work. We did, actually. In every location, we had presentations by our academic hosts. That's the owner of Trackware House, telling us something about its history and its structure. But every place we went to, we had excellent papers presented by our hosts and by many of their trainees. And that is actually an old tennis court, real tennis, because both John Butterfield and John Stokes were keen and enthusiastic tennis players. It was converted during the war in part to a fortification. So we're still, I'm afraid, on our travels and on our sightseeing around Edinburgh and the borders. But we did spend time at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, which is, I think, where we are now, hearing some really first-class research. The old Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, of course, now long departed and replaced by a very, very modern building. Now, we're moving on, I think, again. That's Melville Arnott in the middle, Sir John Ellis, Donald Hunter, George Smart, later Sir George Smart, and David Pike and Nattrass. David Pike was a great friend of mine. He was a physician at at St Mary's, expert on diabetes. He was president of the British Medical Students Association in 1944 when I was secretary of the organisation. Now that is Brian Matthews again, and quite frankly I don't remember where that picture was taken with all the walls covered in ivy and other climbing plants. So here we are. We're still, I think, in Edinburgh. But then we moved on to Nottingham. Now, are we yet in Nottingham? There's George Smart again with John Stokes and John Valence Owen and D.K. O'Donovan and Sir John Badenoch. And the thing that was always extraordinary about John Butterfield as secretary, and of course Derek Dunlop called him Butterfly, he always carried the records and the minutes around of the pilgrims in an open basket. It struck me as being a little bit of an affectation. But there we are. Now, that's one of our hosts, and I'm not quite sure who he was. Now, have we yet moved on? I'm not certain. Nottingham. That's Robert Marler. Yes, Mitchell. Dennis Mitchell was Professor of Medicine in Nottingham, and that is the Nottingham Medical Centre. And we had a useful, a very interesting medical programme. We were introduced by my old friend, David Greenfield, who was the Foundation Dean and Professor of Physiology in Nottingham. And I think that's one of his colleagues, maybe Mitchell, but I can't identify him clearly, telling us something about the university. A very attractive main building at the university in Nottingham. And again, another enjoyable penguin. That's David Greenfield on the left. That's David Greenfield and Sir Melville Arnott. A part of the new Queen's University Medical Centre there in Nottingham, which had not long been opened. And there we have Derek Dunlop again with Robert Marler and John Valence Owen. Oh, that's Leslie Witts, Sir Leslie Witts, who was, of course, Professor of Medicine in Oxford. And he was a pilgrim. He didn't come very often, but he certainly turned up for this particular pilgrimage. That's something of the campus. It's quite an extensive campus around the medical school and the hospital, the Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham. Again, another very good pilgrimage. Oh, yes, that was the Vice-Chancellor's house, because by this time John Butterfield had become Vice-Chancellor of Nottingham, and I remember he laid on an extraordinarily good programme of music for us with some first-rate performers. But don't ask me to remember the names of the performers. I have it in my records, but I don't have that information with me today. Now, we moved on next to Oxford. There was a pilgrimage in Oxford, and there's David Pike, again, John Valence Owen, and we were royally entertained by John Stokes and his wife Joan at their house in the country between Oxford and Reading, very close to the Thames, which was called Ossicles. And Joan Stokes was a most delightful lady and a superb hostess and a very noted doctor in her own right. But anyhow, we had a super party there, along with other pilgrims. And there's Clifford Hawkins again, and John Valence Owen in the background, Melville Arnott's head, and Derek Dunlop, who was still... And that's Joan Stokes, a lovely lady and a very fine hostess. And John Butterfield presenting her with a bouquet from the pilgrims in acknowledgement of her hospitality. John Badenoch, Clifford Hawkins, John Stokes again, Melville Arnott and Derek Dunlop. They didn't make any concessions to warm summer weather, and that, of course, is dear me, I know him so well. It's in a much younger version of... dear, never mind. Everyone else who watches this will recognise him. That's Derek Dunlop again, and John Stokes. Yeah. George Smart. No, I'm just saying that the others didn't to make any concession to the weather by taking off their jackets. Yes. The great pharmacologist, Hammersmith in the middle there. Oh, and that's Leslie Witz. Now, I do forgive him. I do forgive me because I know him so well, and yet part of the aging process is that you forget names, and others will undoubtedly identify him. It'll come back any minute. And that is Derek Dunlop reclining in the sunshine, still wearing his suit, unlike many of the others. Robert Marler there in the background. It was, of course, Sir Colin Dollery. It was young Colin Dollery in the middle there, whom I failed for a moment to identify, but who, of course, was also a noted pilgrim. So we went on to Oxford, and from Oxford, after another excellent programme, this was the last pilgrimage which was attended by the notable oncologist Gordon Hamilton Fairley. He had been elected a pilgrim only 2 or 3 years earlier, and he was at the Oxford pilgrimage, and sadly, tragically, he was killed by an IRA bomb which had been placed beneath a car outside his house when he went out for a walk with a dog. So that was a great tragedy, and I think I've got a brief picture of Gordon somewhere. This, of course, is in Merton College. There is Leslie Witz, there is Colin Dollery, there's John Badenoch, Oxford Manacles, and this is the John Radcliffe Hospital at Oxford in the process of being constructed. It was making good progress at the time, but hadn't by any means been fully opened. Only a part of it was open at this time. But we had our presentations in the premises of the Oxford Clinical Medical School. And there is much of the rest of it still under construction. And, of course, when I was working in Oxford as warden of Green College, I spent some time there and occasionally went to see patients. John Butterfield again, etc. And let me just see. Yes, that's not Gordon Hamilton Fairley on the left. I didn't remember exactly who it was. But there's Clifford Hawkins and Robert Marler. And we went on a bus. And there's Fred Nattrass, who lived in Burford at the time. And there's Colin Dollery behind him. And Derek Dunlop, the faithful, still there, a regular pilgrim. Yes, and that is Professor... the professor of genetics, E.B. Ford, who took us out on an ecclesiastical trip around some of the older and most beautiful churches. And he made that classical remark where he said, as he showed us a suit of medieval armour, he said, "I don't know whether you had the same experience, but just look at the height of that suit of armour." He said, "I found that I couldn't get into my family armour when I was more than 13 years of age," which struck us as being a sort of Oxford history academic from a slightly patrician background, a really quite remarkable and entertaining comment. So, but we enjoyed it. One of the churches was in Swinbrook, very close to the home of the famous family. Again, the name slipped my mind. And this is in Burford, where we're just having tea at the Bay Tree. And now, I think we have moved on briefly to Ireland. I think, yes, because we had a minibus in the pilgrimage in Ireland, and we went around some of the hospitals in Ireland. Had an excellent presentation. We went to Dublin. DK was our host. DK O'Donovan was our host, and we went on to down to Cork, where another pilgrim. That would be another pilgrim. That was Dennis O'Sullivan was our host. We had some excellent presentations in Dublin at various hospitals, and from Cork we went out on a trip on a boat Fastnet. We actually went down and stayed for a night or two in a hotel in Baltimore on the southern tip of Ireland. I'm afraid this picture in Dublin. Now there's Melville on it again, rather a nice picture, and David Pike. The hotel in Baltimore was lovely, and I remember very well going for an early morning swim. A little chilly, but there's Dennis O'Sullivan with John Valence Owen. And some of our hosts, I think. I don't think those were pilgrims coming out there. But again, it may be my memory of names and faces that's at fault. This was I think, not one of the hospitals. Maybe it was one of the hotels we stayed, but still. Anyhow, well, no, it was a university building where we had some of our lectures, and the papers were presented here. University College Cork, I believe. But again, my memory is not as good as it ought to be for this particular location. Now, this is Baltimore, where we went to stay, I think, just for one night in the hotel, and I went for an early morning swim. Lovely. Not very far from Cork. But it was from here that we were taken on a boat trip out to the rock at Fastnet with the famous lighthouse. A rather attractive place. That's the hotel in Baltimore, and it was really quite lovely, where we had a very pleasant stay. And the trip out to Fastnet was a little rocky, but not bad. We stopped at an island and disembarked on the way to Fastnet, and actually had a sandwich and a pint halfway across the island. We crossed the island on foot and then picked up the boat again on the other side. I apologise for the fact this was obviously taken against the light, and I can't tell you exactly what this picture is, but I think it is somewhere on the sea. Now, here is the boat we went on out to Fastnet. It was delightful. Most of us, I think all of us went. There must have been 15 to 20 of us on this particular boat. We were all, I think, rather well dressed, because we hadn't come particularly prepared for a nautical adventure. But there's D.K. O'Donovan. Oh, that is O'Sullivan, Dennis O'Sullivan. Yep. And there, of course, is Derek Dunlop again, and John Valence Owen, and Clifford Hawkins, and D.K. O'Donovan himself, Melville Arnott, Sir Melville, very regular pilgrimage as a pilgrimer, and David Pike again. Sadly died a few years ago, unfortunately, David, rather prematurely. And there's Clifford, Clifford Hawkins. And as I say, we went out and landed on this island, and we saw Fastnet in the distance, and a number of other boats around, but there were a few ruins on the island, but there was a pub in the centre where we got a pint and a sandwich for lunch before going back, and this was some kind of fortification built on this island, and I'm not really quite certain what the archaeological significance of these rocky remains was. But here we are walking across the island, and that's Clifford Hawkins trying desperately not to get lost. He had a tendency to wander away in a rather absent-minded manner. It was a little choppy, but nobody was suffering from mal de mer. And there were these fortifications, somehow or other there'd been an old castle up on this island. There in the distance is the lighthouse at Fastnet Rock. And of course it was a rocky island. I tend, I'm afraid, when taking cinefilms, to take the same thing over and over again. One of my faults, a little repetitive. But the scenery was not unattractive. There was a bit of climbing, and the pilgrims, despite it advancing years, although I was one of the younger ones at that time, didn't find it too difficult. And as I say, there was a pub in the centre where we managed to have a little refreshment before going back to regain the boat. There's the pub which we're approaching as we walk around the edge of the sea. Yeah, one or two solitary ponies on the island, and we're a little more dishevelled than when we started. That's John Badenoch and Clifford Hawkins and David Pike there. And here we are at the pub with Dennis O'Sullivan acting as our host, and a little refreshment came in very welcome. No, I don't seem to have had a picture of Gordon Hamilton Fairley, which is rather sad, but still. Anyhow, we're now on the no, we're not. We're on the train, because we went on the train back to Dublin. Clifford Hawkins, D.K. O'Donovan, John Stokes. Now, who's that behind the newspaper? There's David Pike, John Badenoch, Sir John, and I think that there was a certain somnolence. Ah, yes, a new pilgrim, Peter Ball, was there. I think it was one of his first appearances. We then went on the following year to Cambridge, and I've only got one or two very, very brief pictures. Peter Ball is no longer with us, but the other man who was in Cambridge and who was only fairly recently elected a pilgrim was Gary Love. There's Peter Ball. There's Peter Ball, sadly no longer with us, died a few years ago. And then Gary Love, who was Professor of Medicine and ultimately Dean in Belfast, and who played golf for Ireland of a handicap of 2, and he was a really very impressive sportsman. But again, Gary died rather prematurely, and so only attended probably 2 or 3 or maybe 4 pilgrimages at the most. Now, why it is that I stopped taking cinefilms after the 1976 pilgrimage, I really can't recall, but at least I hope that this particular recording... Oh, yes, the next time, I think, this was in Cambridge, very briefly. No, it isn't. No, yes, it was. Yes, there's Peter Ball and John Butterfield and Clifford Hawkins. Now, what this is, I don't really know. I think in Cambridge, I've got a very brief picture outside... No, this is certainly not Cambridge. This is not yet Cambridge. This is Cambridge. Just Dennis, that's Brian Matthews, and there is Gary Love in the middle, the tall chap next to John Valensoen, with the glass in hand. And there's Clifford Hawkins again. So that as you will see from this recording, some of the pilgrims were very, very regular attenders and went on into what I would refer to, as I now refer to myself, went on attending into a ripe old age. And that, I think Keith Peters was our host in Cambridge, if only briefly. I don't think John Butterfield had yet become the Vice-Chancellor. There's Dick Bomford again. That's Keith. Is that Keith Peters' wife? I'm not certain. Certainly one of our hosts. And that's one of the last pictures of Sir John Ellis, who was the London Hospital and who again was a great friend and a very excellent pilgrim. So there we are. We are coming to the end of this recording, and although my voice-over has probably been in many ways inaccurate, I hope... Oh, and that, at the very end, is one of my great-grandchildren. No, it's not. It's one of my grandchildren. I've now got 7 great-grandchildren. That's Drew, my eldest grandson, who's now in his 30s. So, and I think I'm flying abroad on this one, so we can forget the recording at this stage. These are snippets that should never have been tied on to a recording of the Medical Pilgrims. I hope anybody who watches this in the future will regard it as being a historical document of some interest. And where on earth that is, flying above the land and the sea and the lakes, I just have no idea. But I think that's where we might stop this particular recording. Thank you for watching it.